Salutations, industrialists. It's Mark, your host for today's Gilded Destiny Dev Diary. I have a surprise for today's Dev Diary in that I am joined by some of our team in our London studio. We are joined by none other than Kenneth, Gilded Destiny's executive producer.
Hello.
John, our lead content designer.
Hi.
And James, who joined our team a few months ago as a content designer.
Hi there.
Welcome, everyone. Before we get started talking about today's topic of the event system, I wanted to update everyone on the pre-alpha. As many of you are already aware, we have launched the pre-alpha of Gilded Destiny to a small group of about 100 testers chosen from our Kickstarter and Modian backers at random. So far, we have received lots of constructive feedback, suggestions, and bug reports. As we continue to develop certain systems of Gilded Destiny, we are also beginning to transition to a more feedback-based approach to development. We recorded a Q&A section with questions from members of our community. However, this video, with only the discussion about events, ended up being nearly 30 minutes already. So we will post another video with the Q&A at some point. So, James, before we start, tell us a bit about yourself and your experience in gaming.
Right, so I have been playing games, especially strategy games, for the past 10 years. Started with Sid Meier's Civilization, going into many Paradox Studios type games, EU4, that kind of thing, which also kind of led into how I started making games, because I got into modding EU4. I joined the Ambinar team, a very large team. And I was part of that for several years, eventually working my way up to the lead of the New World Elantir. After that, or taking a bit of a break, I moved to Seattle, where I worked at Nintendo as a debug tester. I did that for about a year. And then from there, I was still trying to really get into the industry, because debug is a nice stepping stone, but it wasn't my goal. I wanted something more design focused. And so I was very happy when I sent out a cold application thanks to one of the calls I saw on your YouTube videos. And here I am now.
Perfect. Well, we're happy to have you.
Yep, happy to be here.
As we are a small but growing team, we are always looking for new talent. So if you're listening and have relevant experience, please send us your resume and cover letter, as James did. Okay, without further ado, let's get on to today's topic, the event system. So, this section will mostly be question focused, so I will ask some questions to our three panelists, and we'll go from there. So, first question. What were some of the inspirations for the event system and the editor in Gilded Destiny?
I think in terms of inspirations, we ultimately want a system that will allow us to try to create as much kind of events that we can have that reflect the kind of history people would expect in the game. So to do that, we kind of need a quite robust system to sort of allow different events to work the way they do.
As I recall, you also said, I remember this from quite a long time ago, you said one of the driving principles of the event system is in fact that it enables us to represent history that the rest of the game mechanics can't do. So that's kind of also another major purpose of it, is to be able to show that side of history that the core game mechanics don't cover in quite the same way.
Right.
Like an assassination, for instance.
Yeah, of course.
And one of the beauties of a very robust event system is that it allows modders to create kind of pseudo-systems that don't normally exist in the game. That was something I mentioned very early on when I joined, was the idea that we should be able to fire an event from as many different places as possible, because then anything an event can do, that system can do to a certain,
What are some of the most important elements to consider for an event system in a grand strategy game?
An event system. I mean, you got the basic building blocks, right? So conditions and effects are the two basic building blocks, and those need to be comprehensive enough that you can both ensure that the event doesn't fire when it shouldn't. For instance, if a country's been destroyed, well, events relating to that country need to take that into account, and events related to other countries that would involve that country also need to make sure they can fire without that country existing, or that when conditions are in such and such a way that it shouldn't that it shouldn't fire if the that sort of thing. It's a bit of a messy, terrible way of explaining it, but the general idea is that it needs to be comprehensive enough to cover lots of different conditions.
Right. You also need to be able to target several different kinds of objects in the game. You need to be able to say, like, oh, if this leader, if it has this trait, do such and such to different leaders, or do any kind of other effects. You need to be able to target countries, provinces, possibly even like a global kind of event as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, of course, you need the event system to be fun. You want it to be able to reflect what happened in history, and you also want it to be able to model kind of an alternate history, I suppose. And through all of these things that we've mentioned, I think those are, those are the main goals, I suppose, right?
Also, it should be very easy to make events. It shouldn't be a tax where you have to go through several different files just to make one event.
Right.
I'm just a little concerned that these two questions are things where player can find a lot of issues with. It's like, you didn't consider this.
Exactly.
Your entire focus is wrong.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's fine.
Consider cutting these ones if you want.
Yeah.
They're so general.
When it comes to missing
or. So basically, we're talking about a lot of different. We're trying to give a very generic answer, which I don't feel like it really answers much about what event system really is, because for people who are watching this, they kind of have a good idea on what it should do. For us to sort of explain that, I feel like it would kind of almost feels like it's...
Of course. Yeah, so I think the point here is we're not trying to give an exhaustive list about everything that goes into the event system.
Of course.
So if we didn't highlight something you feel is important, chances are we have considered it and may already have a plan to implement it. But do let us know. Okay. Right. Yeah, great. So, next question. Tell us about some of the details of the event system and the editor. What are the main features?
Well, as you'd kind of expect, the main sort of building blocks are, you have conditions. When those conditions are met, certain effects are triggered. And you also have events that pop up, and you as the player have options. You pick one of those options, it triggers certain effects when you pick that option. And that's kind of the basic sort of structure you'd expect for an event system of this kind. In terms of how you actually work with that, I mean, it's kind of fairly similar to the sort of if-then statements that you'd expect from coding, but for the most part, it works in blocks. You don't have to write any actual scripting to get that to all work properly. But that's the kind of rough outline of it. It's a lot of drop-down menus, a lot of option selection. Not much actual writing is necessary, except when you're trying to specify, say, a certain country, and even then, actually, that's a lot of drop-down. More often, it's when you're writing the body for an event text or an event option.
Okay. Yeah. Great. So, in terms of writing events, what are some of the main principles for writing?
Well, one of the major principles we've kind of been trying to stick to is that, and I've mentioned this in other ones as well, but a general principle is that we want to give the player the freedom to make bad choices. So in general, when we give them options, some options will obviously be bad ideas, but they should still be there. And obviously sometimes the bad idea is the historical one as well. So that's one of the driving principles. Another one is that obviously we're a small team and this is our first project. There's a limit to how much we can cover. And so instead of kind of trying to spread ourselves way too thin, generally our main principle has been we'll try and do a few things really well. They're trying to do lots of things kind of not so well. So that's another major principle there. Yeah, I'd say those are probably the two of the main ones we've been using to drive us forward. In terms of, branching, we do want the player to have choices and for those choices to be meaningful as well. So the idea is that options will have, most of the time, will have a significant effect. And if they won't, then we question whether it's worth including that at all.
Okay. Great. So, how will certain events be portrayed in the game?
Certain events. Well, there's a major distinction between events and decisions, for one thing, in terms of the fact that essentially decisions are events that you as the player or the country in general can trigger themselves. Usually the AI will choose to trigger them when they're available. But essentially a decision is just a case where, like an event, certain conditions need to be met before it can be triggered, but then the player chooses whether or not to trigger it. Other than that, it's pretty much like an event chain. It's just one that you as a player start. An event chain, on the other hand, is a decision that happens to you, as it were. It's forced upon you rather than you getting to choose to kick it off. So a lot of examples for, decisions would be things like at least from Prussia's side, the Austro-Prussian War or the Franco-Prussian War. Both things that Prussia decidedly instigated. Admittedly, it needed certain conditions to apply before it could actually kick off both of those wars. But in general terms, they still did choose to do so. Whereas from Austria's perspective, that's not a decision, that's something that happens to them. That's an event that is caused by Prussia choosing that decision. Another major thing, of course, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, there's never a case where a country has something happen to it that was as a result of an event choice that a different country made. So, say you're Prussia and you can't unilaterally declare an alliance with Austria that Austria also doesn't get an event for, which says to Austria, do you want to have an alliance with Prussia? Austria also has to make that choice. So in that way, even though obviously when single player, the AI is what's going to be making that choice, but each country will still get an event when it's relevant to them, when if you were playing that country, you'd get a choice. So the countries are still all getting those choices. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's another major thing. Obviously, for specific events, you'd have to ask me about the specific event, and I could go into details about how we're representing that, but bear in mind that a lot of them haven't been done yet, and we're still working on a lot of them.
Yeah, very good. Well, what happens when you make the ahistorical choice? How much alt history will be portrayed in the game?
Well, as I said before, there's going to be a limit to how much we can do there, purely because, you could have entirely different alt history timelines at major breakpoints throughout the 19th century. And to a certain extent, you're never going to be able to cover them all. Part of the point, and part of what we've been aiming to do with the event chains in this regard, is to sort of leave these buds in various places. If you imagine like the kind of event tree, people talk about branches a lot of the time. Well, certain buds here and there where it's very obvious that that's where an alt history timeline would start. And we might venture into that a little bit. And then, to a certain extent, we'd have to kind of go, and then you're free to explore that in any way you want. Sometimes, of course, it depends on your view of history and causality and chaos theory and all that sort of thing. But in a general sense, as you'd expect with any scripted game, right? But the history has to snap back into position, or has a greater propensity to snap back into position than maybe in the real world it would otherwise do. Doesn't mean that there aren't some cases where it absolutely can go off the rails, but obviously don't expect a huge amount of content in that direction, because we kind of need to... Again, there's limitations to what we can do as a team. On the other hand, part of the whole point of trying to make this easy to mod is that we sort of leave these buds there, and if people want to explore those, and equally, we might explore in future, they're available for that. But yeah, that's the general principle in terms of how we're dealing with alt history. Obviously, in some ways, actually, one of the major things we're trying to do that's a little bit different is do a little bit more exploration of alt history than a lot of other historical games have tended to do, because we have the freedom to, in a way. Mm-hmm. And also, for those of you who took part in the Kickstarter, you might have noticed some of our merch. We definitely want to do something with Ernest Augustus. Yeah.
And of course, creating Greater Austria as well. We have a medal for that.
Absolutely, we should have some sort of decision there too.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right. So, in terms of the editor, what's been completed? What remains to be done?
Well, there's been quite a lot of iteration on that as we've been creating more events and decisions, we've noticed things that the editor's lacking, and then we've had to talk to the programmers, and then they make changes, and then we come back to it and we find more things. And as you'd expect, there's a certain amount of iteration and improvement that's been constantly going on there. What is currently being worked on at the moment is enabling certain if-else statements in effects and nested or statements in conditions. So, for instance, in a condition you might say, if Hanover is ally or Hanover does not exist. Is a condition that's obviously you can make that in two separate events and then sort of make them both happen at the same time, and one of them will be true and one of them will be false. But that's a lot of excess events kind of popping up and needing to be tracked. It's much more streamlined to just have a nested OR statement within a different OR statement. We had some ability to do that, but not as much as we needed, really. So ultimately, there's an extent to which what is being worked on the editor now is actually just streamlining stuff that would otherwise take a lot of time to input.
I mean, just keep in mind that we are a smaller team, and we're building this from scratch, and we are discovering a lot of things that in other games that might be something that's taken for granted. For us, we do need to make them from scratch. So it is an iterative process where developers will have to, or programmers will have to design it, and then for us on the content side, we'll have to sort of experiment and try it before we find out what's missing, what's making our job more difficult. So it's definitely will take time. It's not perfect. What we have is definitely not perfect, but it will take time for us to get there.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you're still recording, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can use some of that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, what I could add on top of that, of course, is that there's an extent to which as well, there's the attempt to streamline two processes, right? On the one hand, if you just enable the editor to do everything that coding can do, then ultimately there's no point having an editor, right? You kind of need to find that happy medium between having a tool that facilitates all of the functions and operations of coding without actually requiring you to code. And so ultimately there's an extent to which the programmers and us need to find that middle ground, which is ideal for doing the things we want it to be able to do without requiring additional skills to do those things.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although you did take a little bit of what I was going to use for my
Okay.
explanation, but no,
Well,
it's
you can
fine.
say it as well.
Yeah, I'll say different things.
Yeah.
Did you have anything to add, or?
Not for that. No.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah. So next question. Why don't you guys walk us through the process of writing an event?
Right, so it'll begin with a good amount of research. There is a lot of history that our game covers. We can't all be experts in every little bit of it.
Of course not.
So, we try not to get bogged down in too much detail, but we do need to have a general understanding of the different interests that were vying against each other at the time.
Yeah.
For Prussia, for example, we might have how the potato famine affected them. We need to figure out generally which parts of Prussia were most affected, how they responded, like the different parts of society. You had the nobility's response, the peasants' response, the bureaucracy's response. These all come together in a conflict with different people wanting different things.
Right.
So then taking that general idea, like these forces going at each other, and trying to simplify them down into decisions the player can make. What is happening in their country at the current point? Is the aristocracy very powerful, so you want to limit their ability, and you can use this event to do so? That's kind of the approach we take. It starts with research, but then we need to figure out how to make that useful for the player.
It's a bit like a form of translation in a way. You're translating sort of real history into the straitjacketed forms of conditions, effects, 100-word text boxes, that sort of thing. And yeah, it's a conversion, as it were. Yeah.
Right. What are some of the different ways that you can create conditions for an event? What are some of the different ones?
Oh, like something I've come up across a couple times is, if you have, say, going back to the potato famine, you know that affected specific provinces very heavily because that was the dominant crop in the area. You might not make a specific country event. You might just make a province event so that whoever owns that province, they are the one affected.
Okay.
And given that we are currently focusing on Prussia, we will still tend to tailor those to their perspective. But, there is a certain extent that we want it to be generic so that any country that currently controls this, what their response would be.
Of course. What about when it comes to deciding on effects? How do you make that decision?
Well, as I said a little bit earlier, in general, we'd like it where it makes sense to do so for options to have meaningful effects if you pick them. Obviously, sometimes the meaningful effect can be not selecting the other two options and their effects or what have you. But the general idea would be that it might apply modifiers for a certain amount of time. It might apply a single thing that happens. It might give you certain things, take certain things away. All the sort of things you'd imagine of changing the numbers, changing the variables in the system.
Also, something that's interesting is that you really have this push and pull between our developers and our modding community once they have established themselves, because a modder would want as many effects as possible. They want to be able to tweak as many variables as possible. But that obviously takes development time. And so the extent to which we open up our game to have effects for any little detail, modders would be very happy about that because it lets them create effectively new systems that we couldn't have even thought of.
Yeah,
of course.
But it just takes time and money.
To be honest, I want to be able to tweak every variable in the game as well, but
it's
more about what we can convince the programmers to do. So
because ultimately there's not too much difference between making content and modding a game.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, as we've said many times, the tool we use is the tool that we'll be releasing. I mean, that's kind of the point. So
yeah. So that actually leads perfectly into my next question, kind of aimed at you, James. So as you've just come on board in the last few months and have a background in modding, how easy was it for you to learn how to use the editor?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are things that I really liked about the editor. For example, when it comes to modding a game, the documentation could range anywhere from just, several wiki pages you have to troll through to just non-existent. You have to maybe go to Discord or something like that just to find any information you can. What's nice about the editor is that it's all block focused. So you will set a condition you want, it gives you a drop-down menu, and it tells you what your options are in this context. Currently, I do think it has some limitations in its learnability because it gives a bit too much information. It gives you options that don't actually do anything because it's not filtering out what doesn't apply to the current context as much as it could, at least. But that is something we're still working on. And the point though is that John, as you mentioned earlier, there is a push and pull where an editor will have less flexibility than a scripting language will, but it's so much easier to use than having to pull up a wiki page of what are all the effects that exist, how good is the documentation, did this change to the last patch. When you have an editor, that's already updated for you. You know what is there. You know what you have access to.
And to a certain extent, it also removes, at least to a greater extent than a coding language, it removes the sort of scope for error, right? Because obviously, there's only so many places you can make mistakes if you're not actually allowed to make those mistakes by virtue of the kind of functions you're able to perform. So,
Now, there are limitations to that, though, because something I've learned from modding is that you can force the script into areas that the developers did not intend for it to do, but do actually work. Yeah. And those can lead to very nice results. But that's probably from a game stability standpoint or a mod stability standpoint. The cons are probably not worth the pros.
I mean, to be honest, I'm sure the modders will find ways of, what's the word? Not jury rigging, but messing with the editor in a way that will enable it to do the things that we don't intend for it to do, but they'll get it to do those things. I mean, I've been amazed by some of the things modders can do.
And ultimately, it's in Unity, so people who know that engine very well will be able to tinker with it in ways that I'm sure will surprise us.
Right. Yeah.
One thing that I think we should also talk about is also the map.
Yes. So the map editor is, it's kind of fun to use. Going through and just sculpting your terrain.
You're not going to be having fun. You're going to be doing your job.
No, of course. In my spare time, I play this separate game that we have. No.
I mean, you're actually not the first one who told us this, where some people have suggested we should just push the editor itself, the map editor, as kind of an independent thing where people can just have fun.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty cool. Like, it's good fun to muck about with. Yeah.
And sure, there will always be a little bit of tedium, especially when it comes to creating an entire world. There are so many provinces you have to make, but like I'm very excited to make the Ambinar world in it, for example.
It definitely, and of course, we're aware that there are split opinions about hexes, but obviously the big advantage of using hexes is, of course, the moddability. When I was spending a couple of weeks fixing the coastlines, it was something I could do simply by just adding more hexes in certain places and taking them away from others. That sort of thing is a lot more straightforward to do than if we had to draw everything. So yeah.
And it helps that we have enough hexes so that we can get that more fine-grained detail.
Fairly well,
1.6 million hexagons. And I think 5 pentagons. Or 12 pentagons.
Some number.
12 pentagons.
Yeah, I've never been able to find them.
Same, I've looked for them.
Keep looking. They're right at the corners of all of the icosahedrons.
Right.
Yeah.
The one I tried to find was at the poles, because I figured that's got to be where some of them are. Or, one.
Right.
Yeah, I haven't
not
had
necessarily.
any there,
Interesting. Maybe that could be a community challenge once the game comes out, actually.
I really hope we can have more exciting challenges.
Yeah. All right. So that actually concludes... actually, no, it doesn't.
I think another point, as they kind of pointed out earlier, where you have... it's kind of a work in progress where we are kind of talking to programmers to decide on kind of what are the things that's needed in the editor, but at the same time the work doesn't stop there. In fact, once the game is out, our intention has always been this editor will not just be used by us, but it will be used by the community as well. So kind of as the work goes on, it will as we go further into alpha, this will be something the community will sort of begin to sort of influence how the editor is done as well.
Yeah, great. So, anything else? I'm good. Okay.
Not from me.
Like and subscribe.
Yeah. No, as always, if you have not already subscribed to our YouTube channel, please do so and wishlist us on Steam. So that's all for now. Have a gilded day.
Ta-ra.
Hey.